Hello out there, my name is Casey Lee, and this is just a really quick primer to web development. This is kind of meant for non-programmers and programmers who are actually also just getting into web development, and eventually there'll be more specifics on how this all fits in with Ruby on Rails. So let's just jump right into it. So the only real prerequisite you need for this talk is really you have to have interacted with a computer program before. So typically what happens with a computer program is you'll open up the computer program, right? So let's take Microsoft Word, for example. So you'll go onto your computer, double-click on Microsoft Word, and then the very next thing you'll do is you'll probably open up a file, right? So you go File, Open, and then you'll go somewhere on your computer and you'll go find a document, right? So like a .doc file, or in the case of the new Microsoft Word, the .docx file, right? And what this file is basically it's a file that contains all this data, right? It has all the words that you typed into the file, all the formatting, you know, whether something's bold or italics or whatever. You also have, you know, what headers, you know, maybe some page numbers, stuff like that. It's all contained in this file, right? And what happens is when you go File, Open, and select this file, what's going to happen is Microsoft Word is going to interpret all that data and kind of present it up on screen for you in a nice kind of human readable fashion, right? And that way you can kind of go in and you can edit stuff later and then save it back to that file, right? And this is really how almost all computer programs work, right? You know, if you open up a file in Photoshop, or you open up a Microsoft Excel document, or if you open up, you know, even a file in iTunes, right? You're opening up these files, and the program is interpreting those files and then kind of presenting them out to the human, right? Whether it be playing some audio, showing some text on screen, whatever it is. This is how most computer programs work. Now, another computer program that works pretty much the exact same way as all these other programs is a web browser, right? So you could have something like Google Chrome or Internet Explorer or Firefox, or you know, back in the day, Netscape, you know, all these kind of browsers. And what these did is they interpreted files just like other computer programs. So you typically wouldn't do this, but if you open up your web browser, you can actually do the same thing and go File, Open, and you can find a special kind of file on your computer, an HTML file. Just like Microsoft Word opens up doc files and docx files, web browsers open up HTML files. So you can open up an HTML file, and an HTML file will have all this information in it. We'll have some words, we'll have some instructions on what to put in the header, or like in the top toolbar of a web browser. It'll have information about links and all that stuff like that. And what the web browser will do, just like Microsoft Word, it'll interpret all that and spit it out in a nice kind of human readable fashion up on screen for you, right? So let's take a really simple example. So you can actually go into Notepad or TextEdit or VI or whatever you want, and you can start a new file, and you can actually type this code in: HTML, head, body, hello there, body, and HTML. This is what we call HTML code. This is like the source code. And you can save that as a .html file. And if you go and open up Chrome, you go File, Open, you open up File, what it's going to do, it's going to interpret that and show you hello there, right? So this is how the web works, right? You're opening up HTML files, and typically, again though, in a web browser, you're not hitting File, Open, right? Very often, you're typing in a URL. You're going into the address bar and you're typing, you know, www.cbc.ca, for example, right? Well, what you're doing there is you're effectively grabbing a file, an HTML file, sitting out there on the cloud somewhere. When you type in www.cbc.ca, you're telling the internet, go out to the computer that's labeled cbc.ca and grab a kind of default file that's sitting on that box and bring it down to me, right? It's almost like you're grabbing a file off a network drive. You know, a lot of people at work have network drives, right? So, or network shares or whatever, or even on your home network. It's the very same thing. The kind of gurus behind the internet developed this thing called HTTP, which is a protocol, or kind of like a communication, a set of communication rules between the browser and a web server that's sitting out there. So typically, again, in a web browser, you're not hitting File, Open. What you're rather doing is you're going out to the internet to grab this file, right? So when you type in www.engadget.com, you're going out to the web server, grabbing an HTML file, and bringing it back down to your browser, and your browser interprets that. Now, this is how the web worked for a really, really long time, right? This is kind of like the first version of the web, where the browser kept making requests out to the web server to grab static files, right? These hard-coded files. But then the software engineers got really smart and kind of introduced, Web kind of 2.0 or kind of dynamic server content or dynamic HTML generation, right? And what they basically did was they said, well, before we return this file back to the user, before we spit it back out across the internet to the user's browser, let's do some processing. Let's let the computer process some of that code and spit out a specific HTML out to the browser, right? So that's a very simple example. Let's say somebody in Canada requests www.ca, cbc.ca, right? Well, the processing might say, okay, because this request is coming from Canada, generate some HTML code that's going to say, welcome resident of Canada. And then maybe someone requests the same file from Germany, and then it says, welcome resident of Germany, right? So that's what this kind of processing block is all about, right? It's all about kind of taking some code that you write and generating some HTML that's going to be returned to the browser, okay? So the computer is going to take care of that, rather than you having to generate one page for Canada and one page for Germany, right? So let's dissect this a little bit. Let's see how this looks. Okay, so looking at the HTML, the flow from HTML to processing back to the browser. Let's just take a look at that specific workflow. Okay, so in the past, in the web kind of 1.0 version, you would have this file. This is no different than what we just saw. HTML, head, body, hello there, body, HTML. So this is HTML code that a browser will understand. So there's no need to do any server-side processing of this, right? So what happens is after the processing, the exact same file comes out. Okay, so nothing's really done there. And that file is returned to the browser, and the browser interprets it and displays a nice hello there. Well, again, this Web 2.0 dynamic server or web content, when this came about, we started introducing things called server-side tags, okay? And what server-side tags are pieces of code that will get interpreted by the server, and it'll automatically generate some HTML that will be understood by the browser. So, for example, if you see in red here, all the other code's the same, but what's in red here, you have this kind of less than %sign and then %sign greater than to close off this tag. And that's how you mark server-side code. In other words, code that's going to be interpreted by some processing to generate some HTML. So this is a really simple example. So today's date. And then what that's going to get after some processing, it's going to return some code that the browser will actually understand, Tuesday, July 24th, 2012. Okay? So what happens here is that when the browser makes a request for that file, before that file is returned to the browser, it gets processed, and this kind of dynamic HTML is generated. So that tomorrow, when the browser makes the same request, what happens is Tuesday, July 25th will show up, right? And so on and so forth. So this is where things are really interesting, because then you could actually have, you wouldn't have to code a HTML page for every single day of the year, right? What you would have is you would have something that's based on the request, right? And that's dynamically generated, okay? So that's what kind of Web 2.0 was all about. And then engineers took it even further and introduced some processing on the request, stage, right? So when the browser comes in and makes a request for a page, maybe I don't return that page at all, right? Maybe let's say for some reason we're going to block out residents of Ontario from viewing this page, but residents of Quebec, they'll get to view this page all along. So let's say an Ontario resident opens up his Chrome browser and requests a page. Well, the processing might say, oh, because you're from Ontario, okay, we detected you made a request from Ontario, I'm not even going to return you this page. I'm going to return you a completely different page, right? So there's kind of two sets of processing that happens, kind of on the incoming request for a specific file, and then on outgoing when the page is returned to the browser. This is how almost all web frameworks work, okay? You're talking Ruby on Rails, you're talking PHP, you're talking JSP, you're talking ASP.NET, even classic ASP. This is how they all work. This idea of making a request to a server, having that server do some processing to ultimately return an HTML page back to the browser. That's how this all works. Okay, now I'm going to get specific and talk about how this all fits in with Ruby on Rails. Okay. So this diagram is just expanded. It's not really changed from what you saw. Okay, so incoming, there's some processing, goes to a page, and then processing to spit back an HTML document back to the browser. Okay, but what happens? What is that processing? Okay, it's different for all frameworks, but this is how it works in Ruby on Rails. Okay, so when you make a request from a web browser, and when I say a request, that's either typing in a URL in the address bar, clicking on a link, which ultimately is a URL, or even submitting a form and stuff like that. That all ultimately involves sending a request to the server, right, with a URL. The very first thing it hits in Ruby on Rails is this file called routes.rb. Okay, and what routes does is it basically maps your request, okay, to a specific action. So if you were to type in, www.kclead.com/resume entries, okay, well that might say, okay, map that request to a specific action that's going to go fetch a bunch of resume entries. Or you might have Elliott Farm Equipment /products, okay? And to get those products, it's going to map to an action that's going to go to the database and fetch some products. That's what the routes.rb file is. When you generate a new Ruby on Rails app, it always starts with the routes.rb file, and you'll actually see mappings, okay? Now, after the routes.rb file, again, like I said, this maps to an action, and where this always maps to is a controller class. Okay, so you'll have a controller to manage your users, like a users controller. You'll have a products controller. You'll have a variants controller. You'll have all these types of controllers, right, that manage essentially what we call resources, right, like your users, your products, whatever you may have in your web application. So your routes.rb file is going to say, go to this controller and execute this method, okay? So the controller may have a method to fetch records from the database, or maybe update records from the database, or maybe delete records from the database, whatever it may be, right? It may be that the controller has an action to send out an email, right? It doesn't always have to be database interactions. So the routes.rb file passes the control onto the controller, and then the controller does whatever you want. This is where you start coding stuff, okay? You code methods in your controller. Very typically, in a very kind of simple Rails application, this controller will interact with the model. And the model is kind of like your interface to the database, right? So you want to update things to the database, you want to fetch things from the database, you want to save things to the database. This is what typically the model is in charge of. And so the model is going to spit back records maybe. It's going to maybe spit back a success and saying that you were successfully saved the record or whatever. But again, the controller doesn't necessarily have to interact with the model. It's just very typical behavior. And then after that, Ruby on Rails has some rules on passing things onto what we call the view. And the view is nothing more than an HTML file, and we call it an HTML template, because what happens is we code a lot of HTML, but then we code a lot of server-side tags like that today's date to make dynamic content. Okay, so it passes things on to the view, and then the view gets processed. So all those things like today's date and username and all that gets processed into an HTML file that's ultimately returned back to Google Chrome or Safari or whatever you end up using, okay? So if you want to take home from this talk, right, more generically, this is the diagram you want to memorize. And then if you're doing a Ruby on Rails app, this is the diagram you want to memorize. Because once you memorize this, you'll basically be able to understand the flow of any Rails application, right? All you have to do is analyze, okay, what's the request that was made, and then you can kind of go through this process there, all right? So that is kind of your introduction to how web works and how web development works. Where you would go from here is you might want to do some research on client-side code versus server-side code, all right? Because server-side code is all the stuff that gets pre-processed on the server side and then spits back to the browser. Client-side code is code that, like HTML, for example, is client-side code. It's code that gets spit back to the browser, and the browser is in charge of interpreting that, right? So client-side code like JavaScript, Batman.js, jQuery, CSS, HTML, that's all client-side code. And that can all be mixed with any server-side code you want, right? Whether you're using Ruby on Rails, JSP, C#.NET, whatever it is, okay? So that's pretty much it. If you have any questions or whatever, just head up www.kclead.com. Hopefully this clarified some myths for some people. All right, see you on the next video.